This is a perfect tie-in. Thank you so much. Because spatial, social, and physical just is a great frame for what I'm going to be talking about, which is text as improv. So I'm an engineer and a researcher and a psychotherapist. And if there's anything that I want to do in my talk, it's to put some attention on experience and on phenomenology. It's such a big influence on me in my work with tech these days, is to actually be paying attention to these things, the spatial, the social, and the physical. And underlying all of those is our first-person experience. So we can get really lost in modeling systems and analyzing systems and kind of forget the processes that are happening that end up with those results. So what happens when you take the process and turn the process itself into the final product? Well, you kind of get improv. You get the thing itself is the doing of it in the moment, and how the doing of it evolves moment to moment. And so using jazz as an example, and I'm definitely not a musicologist, but using jazz as an example, we see that it produces something qualitatively different than a form of music that isn't so based on improvisation. And so you don't get concertos and you don't get these huge orchestral suites from jazz. You get something totally different. But you get something that has its own standards, and it has its own quality, it has its own evolution. And so there's a relationship there between that which is highly mediated, such as the orchestral arrangement, and something that is spontaneous. Jazz is a performance and practice, and the product that's created is the artist doesn't know what's going to be produced, and that in itself informs the arrangement of more structured or more pre-planned pieces. So for me, text as improv is saying that text is an artifact of a dynamic process, and that when we sit down and scribble some notes, or when a writer sits down to write the first page of their book, that we're engaging in text as process and text as improv all the time, because we're having to come up with the words that we're going to speak, just like I'm doing right now. And social media has actually turned into one of the best examples of the improvisation without a lot of appreciation for complexity. So we've seen the complexity goes down, right? Social media makes us stupider in some ways because of the way that it lowers the paradigm or scheme to kind of the lowest common denominator. And yet it does elevate the process, so that if you're using Snapchat, you're engaged in something that's alive and in the moment. And you know that no matter how dumb it is, you know that it's right there, that it hasn't been formulated or contrived, or that it's alive and you can respond to it in the moment as well. So I would argue that modern social media has that quality of aliveness, but the intelligence and the cognitive complexity has really been lost. So the broader question that I'm asking in my research is, how can tools facilitate improv with text and with communication and with meaning? And how can we join together spontaneous, dynamic improvisation with the beauty of human intellect that has evolved for so many years, and that culture has given us so many forms. How much time do I have?
You have 4 minutes to talk about M.
I'm really inspired by Andy Clark's work in extended cognition, which he comes from a cognitive science perspective, and he looks at what are the factors in an interaction where we identify with the tool or with the medium. So this was speculated about back to Merleau-Ponty, and also Heidegger, and certainly the phenomenologists examined what does it mean to identify with this body and experience things through a body. And so the blind person with the stick is actually experiencing the world and touching the world through the end of that stick. They're not experiencing it as, I'm going to move my hand in order to move this stick, in order to get feedback. Andy Clark has done a great job of quantifying that feedback, and actually when it hits a certain rate of feedback and you have a certain level of interaction, it completely changes the subjective experience where you start to identify with the tool itself. So my question is, how do we do that with text? How can we create tools that don't have a huge mediated authoring process in order to get the end result, but that we actually are able to go from thought to text so quickly that we have a feedback mechanism that we can build on and improvise with. And I don't think we've explored that a lot outside of linear prose. What else do I want to say that's important? I have a meditation practice that's really influenced my work and my connection with phenomenology, and I've just recently been exploring the Western discourse of phenomenology and linking it with my training, which is in Eastern Tibetan Buddhist meditation. But it all comes back to something that, frankly, is sorely missing in Western academia, which is the acknowledgement of experience as irreducible. That no matter how good you can model something, it doesn't change the fact that right here, I'm having an experience of speaking to you, and you're having an experience of listening to me. And it's infinite how granular we can get in trying to model that, but it will never replace that raw, inchoate, ineffable experience. So how can we do that for text? Questions?
So you talk about sort of, I was thinking of briefing with text, and the thing that just immediately springs to mind is memes. And that, by that I mean the modern version of memes, which is text using something familiar and known, but using wit and surprise at the same time. It feels very usually done quickly and improvisationally to just create reactions with people.
Yeah, I think memes are another example in the social media vein of really leveraging the social network to quickly communicate. And my only my criticism, my desire would be the complexity piece. So instead of flattening our intelligence to this just quick one-off response or literally a meme with just a few words, how do we develop complex ideas that stretch over time and space, but that go beyond linear prose? Because we're not limited by that anymore in terms of the technology, and yet we're still either choosing between highly complex and structured linear narratives or these spontaneous, dynamic, improvisational, flat, simplistic ways. So we're kind of missing this. Thanks. Another question?
Hi. I'd like to flag up that I'd like to talk to you, and I'll explain why. For centuries, we've developed laboratory methodologies. Clean your glassware, wear goggles, keep a lab book. You can explain it at length. There's a lot of it. And then there's a standard phrase: you can't write up what you're doing until you finish doing it. So do your experiments, or if you're doing a PhD, develop your systems, then write it up. And I'm working on a paper when I finish my book, which is called The Paper as a Laboratory. And there's a whole methodology for using a paper as a laboratory. And I've talked about the problem of reproducibility, and that's because people don't understand the methodology for for using a paper as a laboratory?
I am with you 100%. The process is the product. The methodology is the creation.
The idea of methodology is we're making explicit how we operate.
Yes. Yep.
Vint, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking a little bit about your mention of Eastern views as opposed to Western. And a term has come to mind which may not mean anything, but it's sort of precognitive responses to things. We react to things emotionally before our cognitive brains even have caught up. How does that fit into this picture from your point of view, this precognitive notion?
Great question. From my point of view, it's the interface between the conscious and the unconscious. That's what's alive. That if we've fully explicated and formalized our experience, it's dead. But if we can't put words to it, then we don't get very far.
Interesting.
Yeah, Eugene Gendlin's focusing work offers some practical ways to get in touch with that edge of phenomenology where words start to come forth from the void.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks.
No, you're not done yet. One more. We have a few minutes.
Oh, we do?
Please.
Great. Yeah.
Okay, I'm a little bit familiar with Tibetan meditation, not much, because I come from the Theravada side of things. But the thing that, so I'm very familiar with the body is before the thought, and the thought is a lot slower process than the response of the body. So
The thought, what was the last thing you said? It's a slower process?
The thought and because the body reacts first, and if the body remains in a particular orientation or posture, it enables the thought to ends. Now that doesn't actually gel well with the modern Western producing of text. And I don't know, as you're into Tibetan's art, how do you marry the two?
Yeah, I'll just say that I tend to think that reducing the mind to the body or the body to the mind, either way it's a mistake. So I tend to prefer a non-deterministic approach where mind and thought are, they're not linearly causative to each other, that they're actually in a relationship of appearing, the phenomenon appear together. So I would approach it more systemically that way, and that the cognitive and physical, somatic, evolutionary capacity that we have allows for all that to work in concert.
Thank you. So, okay. Appreciate it. Yes.
I just had one comment. I think I really loved your talk, and I just want to say that I think it might be interesting for you to look at some work that's going on in neurohumanities. So that's basically bridging neuroscience with all different aspects of humanities, from religion to linguistics, etc. That might be really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. I'll ask you more about it.
Thank you.